to ready. Always clicking on stuff. Menus like to jump over from one thing to another. I find that exceedingly annoying. One of these days I'll get that all worked out. Welcome to Evolution Hour, and there's our clickety-clack toytukin wordpress.com. Don't forget that there's a whole bunch books worth of stuff there in PDF format. Everything there is available for download, free, gratis. I'm quite pleased with a lot of the material. Was one or two little quibbly little bits I would have in revisioning, but overall, it's an awful lot of stuff going on. And that can give you as to a springboard as to what goes on in the more recent books, where we are expanding beyond the year 2004 to the wonderful world of 2023, where we are today. I was just listening. I had kind of a smile on my face because I was listening to Aaron Ra's ongoing series that Peter helps produce as well. Of reading the Book of Mormon, and he's up to the Book of Alma, and it reminded me just how gobsmackingly stupid the Book of Mormon is. He had also some ex-Mormons that were in the frame that knew all the lore, and so they would be explaining how certain passages would get utilized in the apologetic literature and that of the Mormon Church, and that wouldn't be immediately apparent. All that, and of course the portentous "and it came to pass" that pops up all the time in the Mormons. The thing that struck me is, as the Book of Alma is describing all these battles and all these fictitious cities and things that are mentioned in the tale, and how pretty well strained they are in terms of Smith clearly just kind of inventing stuff out of thin air, is that the Book of the Mormon Church in all that time has never been able to work out a detailed map of what the hell the Book of Mormon world is. And that's because it's never going to fit in the actual real estate of anywhere. And to some extent, because of a description of a kind of a little isthmus, a narrow strip of land, that there has been the impetus on the part of a lot of Mormon pseudo-archaeology to look for the Mormon world as being in Central America and maybe South America. Needless to say, that hasn't worked out all that well. But anyway, I had actually an old book by a Mormon apologist that wasn't officially done by the church, that also tried to piece together a map of things. And what struck me about it, and also the little map that was in Aaron Ra's video this time around, is that compared to Tolkien's Middle Earth, or the Sumerian world of Conan the Barbarian that Robert E. Howard did, it's really not detailed. And so as fiction level goes, the Book of Mormon's not coming in very well. Anyway, that is not, in fact, the topic of our show, as amusing as all of that might be. We leave all of that religion and theology matters to the outer world. As you know, we are going through a source analysis of Titans, the creationist book by Jonathan Sarfati, who has been a pundit in YEC land for quite some time. And he's then teamed up with Joel Tay, who's one of the newer figures in the young earth creationist world. And they're coming from the Creation Ministries international niche of young earth creationism. And they tend to be really in-house, as we have seen already, and will be continuing to see, in terms of what to put up as apologetics for their creationist notes. We're plowing through that chapter, which ostensibly is about biblical kinds, but it's not really much in the way of that, other than just the most superficial discussion. Mainly, it's trying to downgrade evolution and natural selection and a lot of other stuff. In this little section where I'm coming into, there were a couple little footnotes that put in to support the idea that, quote, that not mutation is random, unquote, reflecting, quote, some pre-programmed tendency in organisms to respond even more quickly to environment. That's the counterpart of, created heterozygosity and any of the other kind of little buzzwords that pop up in the creationist lore, where the true creation is taking place in the creation week with the original created kinds, and then everything else is just a little kind of fiddly bit. So they, to some extent, can allow for natural mutation and recombination, but it's all working out the structure of the original created kinds. teeny little problems with that as soon as you start looking at the details. But the two sources he offers for it are a 2017 post from a player I hadn't seen on the field, Judah Ettinger, at creation.com, of course. And in fact, very minor player, because as far as I can tell, they've only done 2 posts at CMI over the last years, and this was one of them. And then Paul Price, who's another fairly peripheral character in the creationism field. This one from 2020 on mutations not being random. And it's pretty much a retread of tropes in this area. Most all of the sources that they were listing were from technical science sources, are ones that were already in my reference bibliography. There's just a few little minor exceptions that we'll want to be talking about. One of their creationist sources that gets kind of slipped down in a little subsection of Ettinger's piece is one from 2010 from Leitner on shrew venom, which I haven't done a source analysis yet on that. Relatively few sources go into that point, because it's fairly old. I kind of will want to look in to see whether or not what kind of work is done since then on the particular topics and how they're making use of that. So I might be alluding to the Leitner piece again in a future episode. It all depends on what happens when I'm diving into the more detailed elements of it. And then, of course, both of the Price and Ettinger ones are riffing off of Sanford's non-existent genetic entropy. And in one case, the intelligent design material from one of the Awarts. So they're trawling through a bunch of different bits. Most of the material from the technical science work is for quote mining, as you will see, because I'll be putting the links up to all that. Anyway, I was interested in one particular element that Ettinger brings up, and that is from a 2012 paper from Bell on evolutionary rescue, which is the idea of how valid a population has to be able to survive environmental change. Are there limits to how much it can adapt in real time, depending on how quickly the environmental change thing happens? And so this is very relevant for conservation ecology and all of that in the modern world. That's not how it's being invoked in here. Now, the paper itself, unfortunately, isn't available online. However, 2012 was a long time ago, and that means there's follow-up work that's been done by people who have been building off of the Bell work. And so one of them is a 2019 paper from McDermott from PNAS, and then a 2020 work from Klausmeier, both of which remind us how the regular scientific community has moved on, and they're making use to work out the dynamics and the genetics of the adaptability of species, and how a variable they can be, and how much stress they can go at the bacterial level and up into other organisms. Compare that to the nothing that has happened in the creationist side. Theoretically, they have this created model, and can it be applied to anything? Can it explain anything? Can it predict anything? Can it lead to any understanding of how you're supposed to deal with a population preservation in the modern world? Nope, it's absolutely useless. Some of this work that they're riffing off of, the creationists are riffing off of, relates to the extent to which most mutations are random. And there is a little sidebar that some mutation incidents can be affected by how critical the gene is, and whether or not certain mutations get preferentially downplayed. There was a 2022 paper in Nature on that, and I'm putting a link into a commentary thing where they were discussing this with the various authors of the work that you'll be able to look at. And it's on our good old friend, the Arabidopsis plant that is such a big stalwart of plant genetics research. Another paper that the creationists weighed along the way was from 2015, Zhang on tarantula venom, again supposedly indicating how there was a limitation. The shuffling about of venom issues is supposedly something that be supporting a creationist model. No clue as to how many spider kinds there are, or how their biogeography would work, or whether there was any dispersal through the arc. It's not on their scope. They don't even think about that. Meanwhile, there was follow-up work in the actual scientific literature. So there's a paper from 2022 by Luedecke, which reviews the field. No surprise that Zhang paper is one of the early works working out the nuts and bolts details of a particular venom in a particular spider. And there's an enormous number of insects in that to play around with, an enormous amount of stuff to deal with. So Luedecke is reviewing just how much still needs to be known on this subject, which you have to get that data field in place in order to make larger analytical studies. But that doesn't mean you don't have some stuff coming on stream already. And remember, evolutionists actually apply their models, whereas the creationists are just waving their nose at the technical work and then not dealing with it afterwards because they don't have any model to apply. So in addition to that Luedecke work, there was a paper from Pineda in 2019, which is on a different group of spiders, but they are working out the evolutionary history of how the spider developed. Now, hi, Jay. Hello, Lamont. These particular spider venom was developing from gene duplications and particular mutations in the various lineages. And so they were able to trace back the proliferation of this stuff into various modalities, all by purely natural means. Be fun for the creationist to give some indication as to whether any of this was in the created spider form, all that kind of stuff, to actually work out what their model is. Don't hold your breath on any of that. That's not likely to ever happen. Price's paper, meanwhile, the other creationist that was the main source for this mutation issue in Sarfati's book, channeled a lot of material, again, that was already in my reference field. So they're just retreading the stuff. And they quote mined a 2003 paper from Shaw, which I will be able to put the link on how many deleterious mutations there were. This was, in fact, just a letter to the editor thing. It was a comment piece, and they're just nicking out little teeny snippets of it for the purposes of their quote mine. But curiously, this was a response to another work, which was a letter by Kitely and Lynch that was critical of their original paper. And needless to say, the creationists were not even slightly interested to dive into that little issue. Well, I'm putting the link as well to the Kitely and Lynch commentary thing, and then you can ferret through and work back to the original paper, and that if you are of a mind to do so. But it will be an indication of how many topics are being brought up and how much detail is being brought up by comparison to the little flippant sidebar quote mining that the creationists are making use of in here in the Price paper. Well, we've got about ready before I'm going on to part 2, I will want to put up my patron people. Let's get our little thing up in there. And as usual, RJ is an old fart who has to work all of this crap out slowly but surely. There we go. And get that up to speed. And theoretically, you should all be seeing our patrons. Not all that clear, but not a huge number. So there they are. Everybody that's on that list of our patrons has helped keep the project going and keep me working through to make sure that I can still get ink and all the other little fuss potty things to work on stuff. Jackson is working on his chapters. He's finished several and will be soon sending the texts along to me for me to put my input in. My 2 chapters have expanded in effect to 3 because the flood material is a colossal amount of stuff that's actually got so large I realized, this is really going to work as 2 separate chapters. And there's some appendices and things that have been added into the thing as well. And then, of course, the big cosmology chapter that I'll be getting to, which I have a massive stuff on that. I'm trying to be very, very busy to biologists come to agreement on yet whether there are 3 domains. Yeah, that's a funky one. As my understanding is they're kind of floating. Jackson probably is higher up on the current material that I have on that. My memory is that a 3-domain model is still pretty much it, where you've got that archaea, and then the different form of bacteria, and then the another form in that as well at the very basal roots of things from which everything else is working out. Now, whether the Loki bunch and that material is going to change some of that dynamics is another kettle of fish. And my suspicion is that there may be missing domains in that bacterial phase, those boring billion and maybe even as well in terms of some of the stuff that's predating Luca, that have completely disappeared, except for remnants of them that are tucked into the actual population thing. But I'm purely speculating on that front. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if the reason why it's so difficult to specify what mitochondria group is the ancestor form for mitochondria is that group in regular bacteria has gotten to be extinct. And so we're looking at a remnant that is only known as the little endosymbionts in our major cells. But that's the thing. We'll kind of see what's happening going on. And it's unlikely that that can be resolved in any fundamental way, because we're not going to find fossil information that would be able to clarify any of that from a genetic end. So it all has to be worked out from retroengineering material. Well, let's get our stop sharing off of the field so my ugly mug can come back onto the field. And the part 2 relates to a Twitter anti-evolutionist who brought up horseshoe crabs last September, the obligatory bit about living fossils. So that comes up all the time. Kent Hovind, Eric Hovind, these various ones like to play around with this stuff. Anyway, they lobbed a mention of a paper on the topic, which I thought was terribly amusing, because I had to kind of do some research to find out what it was they were actually discussing, because their linkages and stuff weren't actually to the paper itself. They were just name dropping the authors Worth and Shear, which allowed me to whittle that down. And that turns out to be from a 2014 paper on the evolutionary truth about living fossils. And then to try to figure out why the anti-evolutionists who had thought to bring this up were so struck by it, because it's a perfectly interesting paper on speciation dynamics and perfectly interesting elucidation about things about the various living fossil types, and it's not really helping the creationist position. I also looked out for a second opinion. There was a paper from Rome in 2020, which drew off of that Worth and Shear work. That on the horseshoe crab, same as ever was. And hello, heat shield. And there's also an oldie from 1994 from Aviz that's still quite detailed on the discussion of how limited the data on living fossils can appear from the today's position, because you've got, if you're dealing with things that are very, very remnant organisms, there can be a lot more variety in the past, but you wouldn't have any way of knowing that because you've only got the little slice to look at today. The big reminder is living fossils are extremely rare in life, not at all common. And the creationist acts as if it's the other way around, that you've just got this positive glut of living fossils knocking around. But in fact, they're so rare that you could probably count the major ones off on the fingers that you have on your hand and never have to worry about taking your shoes off and starting working on the toes. You've got some lizards, you have an occasional insect, an occasional horseshoe crab, which are cousins to spiders. But even at that, if you look at each one of these, you're going to discover that they are not like their ancestors that we can see in the fossil record. They're not the same species, sometimes not even the same genera, sometimes not even necessarily the same family. It can be quite varied. It just is that their overall form is sufficiently boringly not changing that they're classified as such. But if you want to scale your material up, I mean, since we're all tetrapods, you could argue that like there's no difference between a human being and a whale because we're still tetrapods. No. Coelacanths, of course, pop up all the time. And in fact, they're a very varied group. That the notion that they're coelacanths have remained static through their geologic record is just not true. And it's probably the case that an awful lot of these other little sidebar groups that are in that living fossil category are in there and give the impression that there's been no change in the group only because the fossil record is too sparse to document how much variety the sub cousins and all the rest go. I think that's in part true for the the little lizard name suddenly escapes me, is what the bit's called. That's Tuatara, the Tuatara, and others. And of course, the people who feel these things in all the anti-evolution literature that I see are typically just putting up the pictures of the fossil form and the modern form and going, see, look at that. Not offering documentation, not looking at phylogenetic information, not looking at what genetic information is available to find out that that argument really isn't going into any great detail. So all of that stuff is a really wonderful springboard to investigating the fuller scientific information, and also to use as a contrast with what isn't going on in that area in the anti-evolution literature. It's purely just wave their finger at us and say, well, look at that. See, there's been static thing. Nothing has changed. Well, fine and dandy. What in hell in evolution suggests that organisms are on this continual conveyor belt of change? No, if you got a good model, one of the things that is true typically of air quotes living fossils is they tend to be generalists. They live in environments where they can eat a lot of different things and their model works really well. They're nice and stable. In the same way that from an engineering point of view, we still use internal combustion engine designs that are not different from what Henry Ford was putting in cars 100 years ago. Much more sophisticated adaptations to them with fuel injection instead of carburetors and all of that stuff. But Wankel engines and Stirling engines and the many different ways of building engines have all fun and games and interesting elements, but there's a nice durability about the clunky internal combustion engine that has meant it's stayed as a means of doing stuff. Well, organisms are no different. So if you got a good model that works, there's no impetus to change necessarily, unless you have the luck of the draw with a mutation coming along, which connects back up to that notion about how much mutations are random or not, and the environmental circumstance of whether or not you go off into a siding. And then you can start looking at seeing how lineages can shift over time and how cousins can start diverging in their morphological disparity. And for that, you'd have to be paying attention to the paleontology and you'd have to be getting the chronology right. Well, your anti-evolutionist is leaving out most of the paleontology and they're leaving out most of the chronology. Doesn't matter if they're young Earth creationists or old Earth creationists or intelligent designers, that level of this blip and then this blip and then this blip isn't showing up in their way of thinking, in their own model and in their apologetics. Once in a while, but the closest thing you'll get to a comparative phylogenetic structure will be in some of these little things that the intelligent designer puts up of the kind of created orchard versus the supposed branching model of evolution. But it's all very generic, not detailed, not with names attached, not with chronology attached. It's just vague. And in that respect, it's exactly as vague as the Book of Mormon's depiction of the cities in the Book of Mormon, that it doesn't connect up to an objective reality, and therefore is not going to go anywhere. So one bad method to rule them all. That's one of the little tropes that I've been putting up on my tweets lately, as I've been reminding people about the current Speaker of the House and the various people who are showing off exactly the same bad method of insular doctrinal addiction to secondary sources and not fact-checking anything. And that when you find out that so many of the people who have a bad method in one area are applying it in another area as well, you shouldn't be at all surprised at all of this. I'm still batting away on the point that consistently Scalise, who is one of the people in Congress who is part of that election denier circuit and one of the Trumpistas, and he was on ABC's uh, weekend show with Stephanopoulos. And Stephanopoulos asked him not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times to try to pin him down on whether he admits or not that Trump lost the 2020 election. And he would just go railing off on just long, circuitous policy answers and not answer that question, even when dragged back into it. Well, that's what we're getting, is the quick reaction of the deer in the headlight Tortugan mindset, where if you are asking them a thing about the thing they don't think about, and in his mindset, the idea that Trump lost the 2020 election is not permissible, I guess, that means it's just bouncing off the mind shell, and he has to go fractionally till he can figure out what he wants to talk about in his frame. And being a quick politician, he goes into the patter immediately. Yes, something had to be useful on a larger scale for evolution to take the Wankel. The Wankel is an excellent engine in its own way, but from what I understand from the history of it, and it was only used in major areas in the United States with one of their sports cars, where they ran it in that, one of their Zingy, because it's a very nice engine and has way fewer moving parts than a conventional engine, but it's also fussy. And apparently the details of how clean you have to be maintaining the bloody thing, and how the little sidebars on it in terms of lubricants and that meant that it was finicky. Stirling engines, another one that in principle is a very excellent one. I don't think anyone has applied that to any major production model over the years. Other things might be simply from cost. Chrysler's spectacular turbine design back in the mid-1960s was an amazing engine, and technically they still make a turbine car. It's an extremely expensive, very heavy, specialized market, not good gas mileage, but their target audience doesn't care about gas mileage. It's the power plant for the M1 tank. And so they still are in the turbine business, but turbines are expensive to build. The Chinese or Japanese have tried for a while, and they probably are still trying to experiment to build inexpensive ceramic blade turbine engines. But the last I heard was that they still hadn't been able to resolve the issues of easy manufacturing and processing. We'll see. But the thing is that it's an excellent analog to what goes on in the natural world, where the only thing that can happen in a lineage is the stuff that builds off of that lineage. And so although you can radically alter lots of things that build off of that, always at the underpinnings are the same physical structures. So even though we as mammals have completely different jaw layout than all of our little cousins over in the vertebrates, we start out with the same jaw layout, and it then shifts and transforms into the form that we have as mammals, which is nasty recapitulating the long evolutionary history of the synapsids. Another feature that's of interest that Niles Eldredge has brought up relating to cladeism and the difference between natural versus design systems. You can use cladistic analysis to study anything. It can be a design system, it can be a natural system. So you could do a cladistic study of the various features of Louis Quatorze chairs, or cornets in the case, because Eldredge apparently is a cornet player. And so if you try to do that, you're going to find that you don't get nested hierarchies, because unlike natural systems, where the only way things can happen is by inheritance and modification in a lineage, design systems can copy from one another. Yeah, the reason why, as we all know, there was a big flap and an interesting little movie that was made about how the guy that came up with intermittent windshield wipers, they got stolen by Ford, and he had a big lawsuit to get permission on it. And it also meant that a whole bunch of other manufacturers picked up the idea, and so everybody's got intermittent windshield wipers. So in a lineage framework, only the Ford lineage could have an intermittent windshield wiper, and other organisms could look at them and how much they would love to have that on their windshields, but because they don't have that and they haven't got the right mutations to have developed that, they're out of luck. And that's what you see in actual evolving lineages. So the kinds of nested hierarchies of salient characteristics you can do with living organism systems, but that isn't how that works in design systems. And I think, too, in the relation of automobiles for yes, all cars have wheels and they have doors and they have headlights and they have steering wheels and all these things, but the mechanics and the details of how they are built are very, very different. And unless they're getting something from the same part manufacturer, you're going to have distinctive elements that at the component level don't show a lineage between a Mopar part and stuff that's going on at General Motors. That's very different from a design system. And that's why you can see certain features like the famous trilobite eyes. I alluded to that in some of the section of the old tip work that you can find at my website, link in every single video. I'm not hiding it. On trilobite eyes, I think it was in the old chapter 4 on intelligent design, that the ones that the creationists riff off of as this spectacular, multifaceted things and all that, the schizocoral eyes that are so sophisticated, it's only occurring in a single lineage. And so all of the other trilobites that are in a different lineage frame, they can't get a hold of that. Whereas why wouldn't a designer be able to innovate that? And why was a designer going through millions of years of trilobites to begin with? I mean, which then brings up an issue, which, as far as I know, no anti-evolutionist really ponders, is, do they allow more than one designer? Theoretically, the intelligent design movement does, but boy, none of them actually think it through. So why couldn't there have been a designer that really liked doing trilobites? That was their thing, and they did it for a long time, and then they went off on vacation somewhere, maybe it was Zeus, and stopped designing trilobites, and there they go extinct. Ha ha, see what happens. And so designers of dinosaurs could be different than designers of mammals and so forth and so on. In the same way that when we look at design systems, my example that I love to go through, because it's something that resonates with my own background, is a 1959 Lincoln Continental and a 1959 Cadillac and a 1959 Chrysler Imperial. And boy, do those look different. And the reason is because they were designed by different people. There's no commonality. There's no common designer to them. You got Virgil Exner's bunch over at Chrysler doing the Imperials. You got Elwood Ingalls bits at Ford, although the actual 59 design was by John Najjar, and it didn't sell very well. And then you've got the crowd at Cadillac under the tutelage of Master Harley Earl, and then in actual sub-design teams that were in Cadillac and Buick and the various divisions. And also examples of deliberate design borrowing, which happens in design systems, but not in real biology. Anybody that's seen a 59 Cadillac may have noticed that the fins aren't all that tall compared to the previous year's model, but they seem really tall because the back end of the car skates down to these kind of jet engine nozzle tail lights at the back end of the car. Well, that was because of the financial recession that was occurring in the Eisenhower administration that was just screwing the car industry. Sales of cars were plummeting all across and everybody was retooling with these big, huge, wide, chrome-laden monster cars that were not selling all that well because people couldn't afford stuff because they were sliding into a recession. And also, GM was faced with the impact of the Virgil Exner forward look cars. If you think of a 1957 Plymouth Fury, that's the new style of car that they were innovating. And these things really kicked in. 57 and 58, Chrysler was probably doing some of their best sales during this period. And they look very fresh and new compared to the rather fuddy-duddy looking General Motors vehicles. This was also a period when the Edsel came out at Ford, which was the most General Motors-ish car that Ford ever produced. And yet went down like the Titanic, the famous horse-collared grill that was described as an Oldsmobile sucking a lemon. Uh, long sidebar discussions on stuff. But at any rate, the reason why that rake of the Cadillac was the way it did is that General Motors was facing such financial constraints that the poobahs decided that there would be some part sharing. So they'd already done a radical redo of the 1959 model year to take into account how their 58 models look so cruddy compared to those damn new Chrysler cars. So Buick had already designed their very sleek new model. So it was decreed that the 59 Cadillac would have to use the doors that were designed for the 59 Buick. So because it had an angle in it, they had to continue that down to the back end of the car. So that's the reason why the back end of a Cadillac looked the way it does. When someone works in most cases, it will see often than not and likely to happen again. Simple car. Yeah. And so that beautiful example of how there is a selection pressure and a lineage element within a corporate identity in automobiles, but not because there's a single common designer, but exactly the opposite, that there's lots and lots and lots of designers. So I've always wanted to know how any intelligent designer could defend the idea that the little weird Ediacaran and frond organisms that are so hard to classify because they seem completely different from anything that we're used to in the bilateral organisms that are going to become so dominant in the Cambrian period. Why can they defend, if they're not assuming that there's only one designer, how can they defend the argument that the Ediacara biota weren't designed by somebody other than the Cambrian that's designing something else, a different designer for the Paleozoic and a different designer for the Mesozoic and so forth and so on? Lots and lots and lots of designers. That argument, even though it's implicit in their intelligent design apologetics where they say, hey, we're not claiming who the designer is. We're not making any restrictions. It could be a space person even, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But in actual fact, none of them believe that. And that's why none of them speculate in the way that somebody would if they were coming at this cold and we're just coming at it from the data and we're looking at it completely dispassionately without any preconceived assumptions, without any materialistic assumptions and blah, blah, blah. But in fact, you don't see that kind of apologetics going on. I could think of it. I could realize, well, maybe we got multiple designers going on here. That would be consistent, at least with how very disparate things are. Whereas an evolutionist is looking at it, ironically, in a way that is far closer to what you would be thinking of a common designer, but it's not a design, it's a common lineage. So, or to use the baraminology bit, everything is a monobaramin in evolution, to where there's initial early organisms and everything on Earth today is descended in one form or another from these branching lineages. And it's diversified and spectacularly changed over time. Took a long time to shuffle around that bacterial stuff to generate eukaryotic organisms. Once that's going, these things kind of speed up to where you get more and more intricacy and you finally start seeing organisms big enough to be seen without a microscope. And that's the stuff that we're seeing with the Ediacara a bit. And then presumably, hard to tell because there are no Lagerstätten from that period to be able to detail it precisely. But it's, I think, the precursors of the various phyla that are going to be such big deals in the Cambrian period didn't arise in the Cambrian. They were around being little minor characters until the ecosystem collapses. Remember, all this is during a period when there's snowball Earth and there's tectonics and stuff going on. So there's a lot of shifting and things going on in that ecosystem. And we can't rule out the elements of endosymbiotic bacterial things. In fact, some people have suggested that a lot of the Ediacara biota may have been very heavily endosymbiotic in the same way the corals are, or the fact that flamingos look pink, not because they're pink, but because of all of the things they eat that turn them pink. And the endosymbiotic systems that are occurring so preeminently in so many different, or lichens, which are fungi and bacteria in a combination, that sort of thing. And once you get to that stage, then gear shifts can take place, and the Ediacara system breaks down, undergoes a mass extinction. Little things that were operating peripherally and microscopically in their frame suddenly have place all to themselves and take off on a fresh bit. There are a few holdovers. Claudinia, that little tube-shaped thing that looks like about yay big, that presumably has some weird little organism living inside it. We haven't a clue what the hell it is, because they've never, there's no Lagerstätten deposits to preserve that. Also, all we got are their little cylindrical shells. Those things persist into the Cambrian period. So there are holdovers in the same way that, oh God, what's the name of the Lystrosaurus, I think, is the one group of the synapsids, therapsids bunch that hangs on into the one order, makes it through into the Triassic. And for a while, pigs rule the earth, and then climate continues to change, and all those little stupid archosaurs start really getting testy, and pretty soon the dinosaurs are on the scene, and they've got just the golden combination that eventually proliferates, and they become the dominant critters on the thing. The mammal lines are running along sideline in there all during that period. So understanding this sense of lineage and turnover and shift increases our appreciation of what's going on over that long span of time. Nothing like that can go on in the anti-evolution context, because all it is either they're young Earth creationists where there's been the creation week only a few thousand years ago, and then somehow or other proliferations of things, but don't bog down into details. So that means they can never get to the stage of having a detailed breakdown of what Adam and Eve's genomes were, or what the exact genomes of the created horse kind was, that would be consistent with what we know about with extant things. Don't expect ever that to reach the stage. Whereas over in intelligent design, even though they accept the chronology, now they have the opposite problem of, is creation taking place dribbled out over a huge period of time, even though the Bible doesn't say that's the way it is? And then in which case, how many design events are there? What is being designed? How many lineages? Are they individual organisms? Are they mutations within already existing population? What the hell do they think is going on? That too will bog down in the forensic details and reach a complete mess, which is why you're never going to see that happen either. So those are the two polarities that we have, and the connecting thread on it is that systematics issue, where the creationists come up with a baraminology that is detailed-ish, but collapses at the detail level, and then the other side, the intelligent design creationist, old Earth creationist side, just avoids the subject completely, because maybe something in their brain is going, this is going to be terribly awkward to work out. So somebody like Gunter Beckley, who you would think would have all the skill set to be able to work that stuff out, nothing's coming from it. Still waiting after years for that supposed paper on whales not evolving. Gosh, I'd love to see that thing. Beckley promised to send an advance copy of it to Erica at the time they were supposedly still working on it, and I haven't seen diddly squat on it. If it's materialized somewhere, please let us know. Apparently, it's not showing up at Biocomplexity. That's turned into a moribund group, which has been the fate of all intelligent design journals. There have been a couple of them, and they go along for a few years, and then they find basically they're repeating themselves and getting rather bored, and they just stop. At least the young Earth creationists have a support network big enough that they continue to do stuff. It's wheels spinning nothing, but the Creation Research Society quarterly has been ongoing from their beginnings back in the late 60s, I think, all the way down to the present day. And then, of course, you got the Answers Research Journal. You've got the Journal of Creation. It's funky, hilarious to watch. And you've even got the little sidebar stuff that goes on over at the Origins Journal. That's the Geoscience Research Institute and all that sort of stuff. So you've got a handful of still operating creationist journals No counterpart to that to intelligent design, which reminds us how peripheral and niche-like the ID movement is. They're basically now doing conferences and books that retread the material. My co-author, Jackson Weed, has been doing a breakdown on he actually decided to take this intelligent design course that the Discovery Institute has done. Oh yeah, the Miller-Urey stuff. It's treated as a shibboleth by anti-evolutionists because the initial work was based upon what was an implausible model for the early atmosphere, but not an unreasonable one at the time. The pure methane and all that kind of stuff. But it turns out that they then went on to recognize that they needed a different atmospheric model. And so they changed their parameters to make that more realistic. And they got a bunch of gunk, which was at the technology of the 1950s, not really workable to study. They couldn't tease out what the hell it was. And I think it's been quite a few years ago now, since the little vials were locked away. Modern techniques had developed. So they re-examined these little vials and found out that their experiments had in fact produced way better amounts of amino acids than the earlier Miller-Urey did. So that's a springboard about stuff. Yeah, there's no metaphysics. Well, yeah, you've got the fact of the matter is, you know, that all of the living organisms are based on a relatively small number of elements and are built out of amino acids to make proteins, and have RNA and DNA, which are composed of just a small number of things. And the older criticisms of evolution by creationists were insisting that this stuff couldn't occur naturally. Well, we know the amino acids certainly occur naturally, and they occur even in space. And we now know the processes that can produce the nucleotides, both for DNA and RNA, including the pesky little uracil, which it turns out is easy to make if you include phosphorus in the mix. So the chemistry of trying to recreate this stuff abiotically, remember, they have to go back to basic things and gradually build up, figuring out like wet-dry cycles and electric sparks and impacts events and hydrothermal vents. And there's so many different things which they have to simulate in a workable chemical process that you can do in a lab. You can't do an experimental vat that's the size of Connecticut that you stir for 100,000 years to see if anything happens. That's, it's not feasible. But nonetheless, the various pieces and components, bit by bit by bit, come together. The current trend line of the various research that I can see suggests that we're talking about things that are relating to hydrothermal vents, but are also interacting with the surface in a wet-dry cycle. Remember, tides are much faster and much more intense because the moon is closer to the Earth during this phase. So that's a variable that they have to take into account. And that you've got not a simple RNA world where everything is happening RNA. Instead, it's an RNA interacting with little protein bits that are coming up from these various amino acid clusters. And so the other issue that's still unclear, and I think is an entirely open question, is to what extent is the DNA RNA system that we know, because it's part of the only life that operates now, how much of that was just one of competing systems initially when there were other superstructures involving more like clay systems and a whole bunch of stuff interacting to where life gets started. You now have a replicator. You had to have had a big metabolism first guy. So the systems that are building up the pieces that the living systems can build off of to use as power sources and the like, that had to have a self-sustaining natural system independent of replication. And that has to be viable. So that's a metabolism first approach. Once you get living systems going on, Royal Society published, yes, yeah, that's it's still an ongoing stack of material. I try to plug in to my reference field the incoming material on origins of life stuff as much as possible. And even as it is, I've got big swaths of material in a big stack downstairs that eventually will become the Origins or Bust book if I live long enough after we get through with volume 2 of this and the couple other books that Jackson and I have planned. And then there's also the Culture Camp book that I think I'd like to do, which would consolidate the stuff that was going to be 6, 7, 18, the old tip super sure. And a lot of things to keep me busy. But way down the road, I'd love to play around with the issue about how creationists have dived into the origins of life question and what actual research is going on. And it would be even better if I live to the point of where real breakthroughs are made and they go, aha, we got it worked out now. In which case, you'll be seeing the great gear shift going on as to how do they rationalize away that issue. It'll be really fun to see. How many of them will just throw in the towel and say, well, I guess evolution is that because the origins are bust argument. If you can establish how life originated, then that pulls the complete rug out from under their whole anti-evolution gig. Whereas normal evolutionary thinking doesn't care how life originated per se, because all of that evidence for evolution, including therapsids and ALU retrotransposons and all the rest, doesn't go away independent of how life originated, even if it was a miracle. But the creationist who pins their argument on that origins peg has their whole argument demolished. If I live long enough, okay, RJ, we need to get you weaned off the drugs and alcohol long enough to finish your masterpiece. Yeah. Well, I'm busy with all of it. Absolutely. I am an old fart of 71. However, I come from a family that lives into their 90s easily, and that's with bad health. I don't have bad health. So I'm certainly anticipating another 25 or 30 years and maybe more of active operating life, in which case I can finish off more of the Paralogs books. I want to finish off the whole bloody series. There's 12 of the bloody things. I'm on number 3 now. I have the whole superstructure of the story worked out. In fact, I bumped into a fellow who amazingly, we met at a party over in a Halloween party over in Idaho. Turns out he lives literally only a few blocks away from where I am. And he's doing a rather intriguing little science fiction story that's set in the 20th century involving all real science characters, people involved with the Lowell Observatory and a flight to Mars and all that. It's a fiendishly ingenious storyline. And I'm giving him some pointers about how to turn his ideas into a workable novel so that he can publish all of that and have a lot of fun with that. Yes, assuming life expectancy doesn't keep dropping in the US, I'm so mad about that. Well, or that we have an asteroid impact or a nuclear war, or who knows what can happen, or I get hit by a truck walking across the street. I mean, there's so many little things that can go wrong. But nonetheless, I remain busy as a beaver. Given what the books you see behind me, all of which are available in Amazon, click, buy for Christmas. Remember, holidays coming up, stocking stuffers, although they're awfully fat for stocking stuffers. But the first one only came out in 2016. So I've done 4 books in the 7 years and working on the second volume of The Rocks Were There and book 3 of that. So I'm a fairly active little fellow. That's independent of all the other little projects, like my little politique game that I'd like to get going on that project as well. That'll probably take a couple of years down the road. That has couple $100 to be able to make a test model of that, and I have a bunch of budget things I have to deal with before that. Need a new garage door. There's a whole bunch of little sidebars on that, but nonetheless, we keep busy. And so, as a air quotes retiree, I can tell you I am way busier than I have been in all my life, because I'm also revved up on it because I'm doing a project that I love to do. And I think it's very important and interesting and contributes works that didn't exist before and actually clarify the field once they're there. So, and my science fiction stories, they're rip snortingly fun. So I always put the links in to every video. If you like reading science fiction mystery stories and like history from the past at Jules Verne, Edwardian, Victorian era, consider Paralogs of Fog. Consider it as a gift for people that who like that sort of thing. Same thing with the science books. And also, if you have a library that could be benefiting from that they accept donations of books and that, buy copies and donate them to the library, all that. Anybody that lives within an eye shot or wishes to send me a copy initially, I will be happy to sign it. I've done that for people too. So there's the autograph copies and all that. So we're busy little beavers on that. And don't forget, there's a ton of stuff that at least gets you diving into a lot of the issues, 3 macroevolutionary episodes and all that that's at the website. That's all freebie PDFs. Everybody can have those. Share them with abandon. And then give them a nudge to buy the books and become a patron to the project so that I can add some more names onto my little blue card that's so blurry at the beginning of the show. So, and I think we need to do an important thing, which is to put up our advert for our little rocks were there. So where are we? Since we're coming up practically on an hour. Wait for my little thing to pop up. There you go. And let's get our share screen. Zippity doo. And there we go. Try that again. And there's the advert. Thanks again to Dear Peter, who did the opening logo bit with my clickety-clack steampunky overture, and then the advert for Roxworthy. I'm sure we'll be doing one for the Roxworthy too when that comes out as well. So we are actually at just about an hour on our evolution hour. Everybody remember to stay safe where you are with heat waves and cold snaps and bombs falling in certain spots and all the different troubles that can travail, and the worrisome issue about what to do with wooden penguins. I mean, it's an ongoing concern of mine. So everybody stay safe, be curious, investigate, buy all my books, give them out as gifts, become a patron to the project if you can. If you can squeak a little buck or two a month, that makes a difference. And the more people that do that, the merrier. So thank you very much, and we will see you kids all next week. Bearing in mind, as we move towards into November and December, then there's more possibilities that I may be skipping an occasional show because of being with the holiday stuff. But odds are most of the shows will still be operational into the new year. And then we're on our regular pathway. So see you all next week, kids.